Welcome back. Let everything slow. There is a kingdom in the north, Boletaria, a name that, by the time anyone outside its borders first hears it spoken with urgency, already means something terrible. The fog, the demons, the souls consumed, the king who did what he did. But before all of that, before the deep fog swept across the land and cut it off from the world, Boletaria was what every kingdom hopes to be. Prosperous, respected, protected by warriors whose names meant something, governed by a king whose people believed in him. The game begins in the middle. It ends at the threshold of the choice about what to do with what the catastrophe produced. To understand either, to understand why the choice at the end matters, why the specific people the player encounters in the fog carry the weight they carry. You have to go back to before the fog arrived. Tonight, we start at the beginning. Not at King Allant XII and his choices, though he is central to everything, at the world that existed before those choices, and at the specific history that made those choices possible. What souls are. The foundation of demon souls' entire cosmological structure is the soul. Not in the vague metaphysical sense that every fantasy setting uses the word. In the specific functional sense of a substance that is the animating principle of living beings, that can be extracted from one being and used by another, that has a weight and a quantity and a quality, that can be measured and accumulated and deployed. Souls in Boletaria are real things. They are what makes living beings alive, what differentiates a person from a corpse, what the demons consume when they consume. When a demon takes a soul, a being whose soul was taken does not die in the conventional sense. They continue to exist as a body, but as a body without the animating principle that made it a person. The specific horror of the soulless, the hollow, mindless creatures that wander Boletaria after their souls have been consumed, is the horror of existence without the quality of existence that makes existing worth anything. The soul arts are the specific set of practices that channel souls as a source of power, not worship or prayer or conventional magic. The specific manipulation of soul substance as an energy source, as a resource that can be gathered from others and used to enhance one's own capability. The soul arts are powerful. They are also, in the specific way that demon souls' most important things tend to be, corrupting, not in the slow metaphorical sense, but in the specific functional sense of a practice that, used widely enough, stirs something that is better left unstirred, the old one. The entity that sleeps below the Nexus, whose specific nature the game approaches with the specific productive ambiguity of From Software's most carefully maintained mysteries. It is referred to as a demon, the first, the origin, the source of all the others. It is also referred to as a merciful gift from God, in the specific reading that King Allant eventually adopted as his justification for what he did. It is a soul-devouring entity of immense power, whose sleep is maintained by the specific suppression of the soul arts, whose awakening is triggered by their widespread use, whose appetite when awake produces the deep fog and the demons that spread within it. It cannot be killed. This is the specific constraint that the game's entire story operates within. The Old One is not a final boss in the conventional sense of a powerful enemy that can be defeated. It can only be put back to sleep, lulled by the specific ritual that the Maiden in Black performs, returned to the dormancy that prevents its appetite from consuming everything. The question is never how to destroy it. It is always how long the sleep will last before something stirs it again. The First Scourge, in the distant past, before the kingdom of Boletaria in its current form, before the reign of Allant XII, before the specific events that the game depicts, the Old One was awakened, not by Allant, not by a deliberate act of despair-driven decision, by the accumulated use of the soul arts reaching a threshold, by one who sought greater power awakening, what the seeking had always been building toward. The First Scourge. The colourless deep fog swept across the land. Demons emerged within it. The souls of the living were consumed, the specific devastation of an entity whose appetite is unlimited and whose methods are unstoppable. Working through the world in the specific way of a thing that does not make war but simply eats, was contained only after immense cost. By the time the Old One had been put back to sleep, half the world's population had been destroyed by the fog. Half, not in the exaggerated way of historical accounts that round catastrophic losses upward for dramatic effect, as a specific number that the law preserves as the cost of the First Scourge's full expression through the world before it was contained. The heroes who survived the quest to lull the Old One back to sleep became Monumentals, not simply celebrated veterans of a terrible war, transformed. Half-living beings who had chosen to tie their existence to the Nexus, to sustain the specific structure that kept the Old One suppressed, to maintain the vigil that the world's ongoing safety required. The Monumentals are one of demon souls' most specific and most melancholy groups of figures. They had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to the world. They had been given the specific burden of ensuring it did not happen again, and the way they were given that burden, the way they had accepted it, was by becoming something between alive and dead, sustained by the Nexus, unable to fully live or fully die for as long as the vigil continued. The soul arts were banned. The 6 Archstones were given to the rulers of the remaining lands as a way to maintain connection to the Nexus and to the Monumentals' oversight. The knowledge of what had caused the First Scourge was preserved as the specific reason that the prohibition was maintained. The world rebuilt. The population grew again. The kingdoms developed, the centuries passed, and the knowledge of what had happened, the specific institutional memory that the prohibition required, faded. The Archstones and the structure of the world, the 6 Archstones, the specific magical objects given to the world's rulers after the First Scourge, each one a connection to the Nexus, each one a reminder of the obligation that the rulers of the world's regions carried toward the specific suppression of what had almost destroyed everything. Boletaria's Archstone was one of these. The kingdom that Allant XII eventually inherited was, in the formal structure of the post-First Scourge world, one of the 6 nodes of the Nexus's network, one of the specific points through which the Monumentals' oversight extended into the material world. What the Archstones actually looked like, in practice in the centuries between the First and Second Scourge, is a picture assembled from item descriptions and NPC dialogue rather than direct exposition. The Archstones were forgotten by humanity. The Monumentals began to slowly perish. The specific half-life of being sustained by a structure rather than by ordinary biology, diminishing as the centuries accumulated. Knowledge became legend, became superstition, became nothing in particular. Only one Monumental remained in the period of the Second Scourge to guide the slayer of demons. One from the heroes who had survived the First Scourge and accepted the vigil's burden. One remained. The others had perished across the centuries, and whatever their passing cost the structure they had sustained, it had not been enough to trigger the prohibition's end, but it had been enough that the structure was weakened, that the oversight was diminished, that, when someone in Boletaria finally made the decision that the soul arts were worth reviving, worth the risk, worth the potential consequences, worth whatever came after. There was less standing between that decision and its consequences than there had been in the centuries immediately after the First Scourge. Boletaria before Allant XII. The kingdom of Boletaria had a history before Allant XII that the game documents through fragments rather than continuous account. Item descriptions, the specific names of events and places that characters reference as though the player knows the context, which they do not, since the player arrives in the fog long after the history that shaped everyone present had concluded. Boletaria had been powerful. The armies of Boletaria were among the most formidable in the region. The Twin Fangs, the royal knights whose specific designation marked them as the finest warriors in the kingdom's service, were the apex of a military tradition that had been building across generations. The three heroes of Boletaria, Alfred, the Knight of the Tower, Methodus, the Knight of the Lance, Ulan, who commanded a legion of archers, were figures of specific renown, warriors whose names the kingdom's citizens had grown up with as models of excellence. The church had deep roots. The specific religious tradition that Saint Urban represented, the tradition that understood God as the source of the miracles that the church's faithful could channel, that interpreted the world's events as expressions of divine will and divine testing, had been part of Boletarian culture for long enough that it was simply how things were. The sixth saint, Astrea, the maiden worshipped for her purity. These were not fringe figures. They were the center of how Boletaria understood the sacred. Allant XII came to the throne in this context, a kingdom with military pride and religious tradition, and the specific prosperity of a place that had been doing well for long enough that the memory of how fragile prosperity can be had diminished to the point of being theoretical rather than experiential. He was, by the accounts that survive, genuinely good. The law description of Allant XII before his descent emphasizes that he was a magnanimous and beloved ruler who cared deeply for his subjects and fought valiantly against the demons remaining from the First Scourge. He was not a tyrant who arrived at corruption through the specific path of power enjoyed without accountability. He was a king who loved his kingdom and who fought for it, and who, in his old age, could not sustain the specific emotional capacity that loving something produces when the world keeps demonstrating the fragility of everything worth loving. The discovery of the Nexus. Allant XII found the Nexus, or was drawn to it. The specific process by which a king descending into melancholy in the old age of a successful reign encounters the hidden structure beneath his own kingdom is not detailed in a linear account. It is assembled from what the NPCs say and what the item descriptions preserve. He found it. He descended into the Nexus, and there, in the specific space between the material world and whatever the Nexus represents, the realm of souls, the specific location where the Maiden in Black tends the structure that keeps the Old One asleep, he encountered the Maiden in Black and learned the soul arts. Not simply learned, mastered. The specific power that the soul arts offered to a being of Allant's capability was significant. He returned to Boletaria with this knowledge and ushered in an age of unprecedented prosperity. This is what the soul arts do. At their most functional and most beneficial, they provide power, they produce capability, they make things work better than they worked before. Boletaria prospered, the soul arts spread, their use became normal, became widespread, became the specific kind of practice that once it is distributed through a population cannot simply be retracted by a single king's decision, and the threshold approached. Allant's melancholy deepened. The prosperity it brought did not resolve the specific sorrow that had been growing in him since his old age began. The specific recognition of a thoughtful person who has lived a long life, that the world produces suffering in a way that good governance can mitigate, but cannot eliminate. He looked at his prosperous kingdom and saw beneath the prosperity the specific suffering that prosperity does not cure. He developed a theology, a specific argument about the nature of the world, and what would constitute genuine mercy within it. The argument that eventually produced the second scourge. Sleep well, 7 more parts remain, and King Allant has reached his conclusion. King Allant XII made his decision, not in a single catastrophic moment of madness, in the specific way of someone who has thought carefully about something terrible and arrived at what they have convinced themselves is a logical conclusion. The decision to awaken the old one was not impulsive, it was reasoned. It followed from premises that Allant had developed across the long melancholy of his old age, in the specific way that wrong conclusions can follow from genuine observations, through the mechanism of caring too much and thinking too long in isolation. Tonight we follow the second scourge, how it began, how the fog spread, what it produced in each of the 5 regions of Boletaria, that the slayer of demons would eventually enter, and we follow Allant himself, not simply as a villain, though the outcome of his decision was villainous in its effects, but as the specific kind of tragic figure that Demon Souls was built around, a person who was trying to help. The theology of mercy. Allant's argument was this: suffering is the fundamental condition of existence, not as an abstract philosophical position, but as a specific observation about the world as he had lived in it. He had been a beloved king. He had fought for his people. He had brought prosperity to his kingdom through the soul arts. And the suffering had not ended, the fundamental structure of human existence. The illness and the grief and the violence and the specific cruelty that people inflict on each other, and that the world inflicts on all of them, was not amenable to good governance. No one wishes to go on. This is the specific statement that the true King Allant makes when the slayer of demons finally reaches him inside the old one. A warning or a confession or both. It is the conclusion of the specific argument that had been building across his old age. Not that people say they do not wish to go on. That, in the deepest truth of their existence, they do not. That the suffering is not worth what living produces in the spaces between. The old one, in Allant's theology, was mercy, not the monster that the Monumentals tradition had always described it as, not the poison that the introductory narration called it, the specific gift of God to a world that had been suffering since its creation. The mechanism through which the suffering could be ended, not through the incomplete mercy of individual death, but through the complete mercy of consuming everything. Whether God actually sent the old one, whether the specific theology that Allant had constructed had any relationship to the actual nature of the divine, the game does not confirm. What it does is take his arguments seriously enough to let him make it, clearly enough, that the player who reaches him can understand the specific reasoning, rather than simply encountering a madman. He was not mad, he was wrong in a specific and devastating way. Wrong about whether ending existence constituted mercy. Wrong about whether the decision was his to make. Wrong about whether the suffering was universal in the way his generalization required. But the argument that led him to the second scourge was coherent. It followed from premises that his life had given him. The horror is not that a mad king did something irrational. It is that a thoughtful king reached a terrible conclusion through genuine thought. He took up Soulbrandt, the demonic blade that was one half of the northern regalia, whose power strengthened in the hands of a wielder who used it for evil purposes that represented the sinful path of those who coveted the souls of others for greater power. He returned to the Nexus. He descended to where the Old One slept, and he woke it. The deep fog, the colorless deep fog, the specific quality of the fog that the Old One's awakening produces, deserves particular attention, because it is not simply a visual effect, it is a living thing. The active expression of the Old One's presence in the world, the specific medium through which the demons move and through which souls are consumed. Colorless, not the grey of storm clouds or the white of sea fog. The specific colorlessness of something that takes light, but does not give it back, that covers the world without being a simple opacity. Those who enter the deep fog find that the world within it has changed. Not simply covered, but altered. The specific geography and the specific rules of ordinary existence replaced by something organized around the Old One's appetite. The fog does not move in ordinary weather patterns. It does not respond to wind or heat. It advances at the rate the Old One's hunger advances. Slowly enough that the approaching edge can be observed, fast enough that fleeing it is not a simple matter of walking in the opposite direction. Neighboring kingdoms sent scouts to investigate when the fog first appeared around Boletaria's borders. None returned. One person escaped. Valarfax of the royal twin fangs, Bior's brother, one of King Allant's finest knights, broke through the fog's barrier and reached the outside world. He was the one who let the rest of the world know what Boletaria had become. The specific act of one person escaping from something meant to be inescapable, fighting through the fog and the demons, and the specific gravity of the Old One's domain, pulling at everything within it, was what allowed anyone outside Boletaria's borders to know that something worse than political catastrophe had happened. Warriors came, drawn by the rumor that demon souls, the specific powerful souls that the demons carried, were worth the risk of entering the fog, drawn by the desire to help, by religious obligation, by simple greed, by the specific mixture of motivations that sets people into places they know are dangerous. None of them had returned by the time the game began. The Slayer of Demons was among those who came, the player character, whose sex and appearance are customized at the beginning of the game, whose specific history before the fog is not documented, entered the deep fog, was killed almost immediately, as everyone who entered the fog was killed almost immediately by one of the Old One's demons, and found themselves in the Nexus. The Nexus is the game's hub, the space between the material world and the Old One's domain, the specific realm that the Monumentals had built their vigil around, the location where those bound to it by the Nexial binding found themselves when their bodies were destroyed in the fog. It is beautiful and still, and faintly wrong, in the specific way of a place that exists because of something terrible. The architecture, the specific candles that the Maiden in black tends, the archstones that connect to the world's 5 remaining accessible regions, the monumentals who stand or sit in their half-living vigil. All of it has the quality of something maintained rather than natural, a structure that requires continuous effort to remain what it is. The Maiden in black greeted the Slayer of Demons, the specific figure who served as both guide and gatekeeper in the Nexus, the blind woman with the fire-lit staff, who is, the lore eventually reveals, herself a demon, not the kind that consumes souls indiscriminately, the kind that tends the Nexus, that performs the specific ritual of lulling the Old One to sleep, that provides the Slayer of Demons with the mechanism for growing stronger by channeling the souls they collected. She was a teacher to King Allant, The game's lore is specific about this. It was through the Maiden in Black that Allant learned the soul arts, that he gained the knowledge he brought back to Boletaria and used to initiate the prosperity that preceded the Second Scourge. Whatever she intended by this teaching, whatever her relationship to the Old One and to the Nexus that made her the appropriate figure to teach it, the outcome included his eventual return to awaken what she had been tending the suppression of. The Monumental who remained told the Slayer of Demons what needed to be done. Travel to the 5 regions, kill the Archdemons, the most powerful demons that the Old One had placed as anchors in each region, the specific concentrations of the Old One's power that maintained its presence in those areas. Collect the Archdemons' souls, use the accumulated power to reach the Old One itself, and then decide the 5 regions and what the fog had done to them. Each of the 5 accessible regions of Boletaria that the Slayer of Demons could enter through the Nexus's archstones represented a different facet of what the Second Scourge had done to the kingdom, not simply different environments, different expressions of the Old One's appetite working through different pre-existing conditions. The Boletarian Palace, the seat of Allant's power, the military and political center of the kingdom, now occupied by the 3 heroes of Boletaria in their demonic transformed forms. The 3 warriors, Alfred, Matus, Ulan, who had been the kingdom's finest before the fog arrived, had been twisted into demonic entities. The Boletarian Palace became home to the might of 2 fire-breathing dragons, and the 3 heroes of Boletaria, transformed by the demonic fog. They were still guarding the pathway to the false king, not because they had chosen to serve the demonic order, because the fog's transformation of their bodies had not eliminated the specific loyalty that had been the organizing principle of their existence before the transformation. They had been the king's protectors. They remained protectors in the specific broken form that the fog's transformation had left them, guarding the path to the demon that wore the king's appearance. The Stonefang Tunnel, the excavation site, the industrial heart of Boletaria's mining operations, the place where the workers who devoted themselves to the kingdom's military-industrial machine had labored before the fog came. They had not fled when the fog arrived. This is the specific detail that Stonefang preserves. The miners, when the fog swept in, stayed. Rather than attempt to flee, they remained behind. Now devoid of sentience and soul, they mindlessly continued to chisel away at the tunnels. This is one of the most specifically devastating details in all of Demon Souls' environmental storytelling. The miners whose souls had been consumed were still doing the work they had been doing when the fog arrived. Not because the demonic transformation had given them new instructions, because the specific routines of their working lives had been deep enough that the remnant of their existence, after the soul had been taken, continued performing them. They were loyal to a kingdom, and a king they could no longer comprehend. In the form of empty bodies carrying out the tasks those bodies had been assigned. The Tower of Latria, the former prison, the specific institutional architecture of captivity, now occupied by demons, whose approach to the souls of the living was the specific approach of creatures designed for imprisonment. The mind flayers that inhabited Latria were not simply powerful enemies. They were beings whose specific function was the consumption of the mind, the targeted extraction of the specific psychic quality of a person's consciousness, leaving the body but removing what had organized the body's experience. Those who entered Latria and survived, the mind flayer's attention did not escape unchanged. The specific vulnerability of encountering something whose attack was not against the body but against the soul, was one of the things that Latria's atmosphere communicated through every element of its design: the shrine, the storms, the ancient burial ground, the specific location where the dead of the pre-fog world had been interred, whose relationship to the soul substance that the Old One fed on made it a site of particular significance in the Second Scourge's geography. The storm demon who anchored the Old One's presence here was a creature of elemental scale, not a being of intelligence or will, but of the specific natural force that the fog had incorporated into its domain, the Valley of Defilement. The lowest place in Boletaria's geography, the specific location where the kingdom's most abandoned and most desperate had already been living before the fog arrived. The lepers, the diseased, the specific population that every functioning kingdom produces at its margins and does not choose to look at directly. The fog found them there. What it produced in the valley was not different in kind from what it had produced everywhere else, but it was concentrated in the specific way of something that had already been at its worst before the worst arrived. The false king, the most immediately significant of the 5 regions for the overarching narrative. The Boletarian palace because it contained King Allant, or rather, the specific thing that occupied the place that King Allant had left behind. The false King Allant, a demon, created by the real King Allant at the height of his power, before he descended into the Old One and was transformed, fashioned in his own likeness to lead the demonic armies in Boletaria. Not simply a disguise or a puppet, a specifically constructed demonized version of Allant at his most capable, embodying the specific combination of his political authority and his martial capability that had made him the king he had been. He had built his own replacement that would continue his work after he had retreated into the Old One's depths, set it as his representative in the palace, as the face that the surviving citizens and the incoming warriors would encounter as the king's authority. The specific act of a person who has decided to disappear, who is committed to the specific course of action that requires leaving the world as they had inhabited it, arranging for a continuation of their function before the disappearance. The false king fought as a warrior of immense capability. The specific combination of soul arts and physical power that Allant at his peak had represented was present in this demonized version. The Soulbrandt that the demon carried, the specific attacks that combined the blade's soul-consuming property with the physical power of a constructed demon. When the false king was defeated, when the slayer of demons finally reached the palace's deepest section and killed the thing wearing Allant's appearance, the fog that had been blocking further access to the Boletarian palace lifted. The path to the true King Allant opened. The path to the bottom of the Nexus and to the Old One itself became possible. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and the Nexus awaits. The deep fog is not empty. This is the specific quality of Demon Soul's world that distinguishes it from a simple monster-filled dungeon. The fog did not simply replace the people who had been in Boletaria with enemies. Many of the people who had been in Boletaria were still there, and many of those who had heard of Boletaria's fate, who had entered the fog for their own reasons, were still there too. The Nexus became a gathering point, not because anyone had chosen it in the way that one chooses a destination, but because being killed in the fog sent your soul to the Nexus, and the nexual binding kept those souls in that space until the conditions that had trapped them were addressed. The Slayer of Demons arrived in a Nexus that was already populated by the survivors, by the people who had come before, who had tried and failed, or who had simply arrived and not found a path forward. Tonight we follow them. The specific people in the fog, who they are, what brought them, what they want, and what their presence in the Nexus reveals about Boletaria and about the Second Scourge, the crestfallen warrior. The first voice the slayer of demons encounters after the Maiden in black, a figure in blue phantom form. The specific appearance of a soul bound to the Nexus, inhabiting the space between full physical presence and complete dissolution, sitting near the first arch with the specific posture of someone who has been sitting there for a long time and has found nothing better to do. He is not optimistic. The crestfallen warrior's function in the Nexus is to serve as the voice of a specific kind of despair, not the dramatic despair of someone in active crisis, but the particular resigned quality of someone who has processed the situation they are in and arrived at the conclusion that the situation does not have a good outcome. He has a theory about the Monumentals, not Allant. The crestfallen warrior's specific claim is that it was the Monumentals themselves, not King Allant, who awoke the Old One, and that the Nexial binding that traps souls in the Nexus was their means of assembling the warriors they needed to undo their own mistake. That King Allant was merely a powerful warrior seduced by the call of the Old One, as the player might be at the game's end, rather than the cause of Boletaria's destruction. This theory cannot be confirmed. The game does not offer a resolution to it. The Monumental's official account, the one that the Monumental himself provides, contradicts it. But the specific quality of a theory that makes sense from a certain angle, that reframes the entire moral structure of the game's premise, that cannot be simply dismissed, is characteristic of the specific way Demon Souls handles its most important ambiguity. Whether the Monumentals caused the Second Scourge through their own hunger for power and are now using the Slayer of Demons to clean up their mess, or whether Allant was genuinely responsible and the Monumentals are genuinely trying to help. The game trusts the player to sit with both possibilities simultaneously. The crestfallen warrior himself has not found a way forward. He sits, he offers commentary on the hopelessness of the situation with the specific dark humor, who has accepted their situation without being pleased about it. He is a mirror for the player's potential fate, what it looks like when someone enters the fog and cannot find a way through it. Thomas, the Stoic, a widower, his wife and daughter were either slain or turned into demons when the deep fog swept in. The specific phrasing of the law is careful about this, acknowledging that the exact fate of Thomas's family is not known to him, that the ambiguity of not knowing whether someone you loved was killed or was transformed is its own specific form of suffering. He has made his home in the Nexus, not because the Nexus is where he wants to be, because the Nexus is where he is. And Thomas has taken the specific practical approach of someone who has decided that dwelling on the past is not a functional response to what cannot be changed. He stores items. He helps in the ways he can help. He does not elaborate on what he lost. This is the specific quality of Thomas's characterization that makes him quietly devastating to players who engage with the law carefully. He is not performing grief. He is simply present, doing something useful, having processed his loss into the specific stoic functionality of someone who cannot afford to stop functioning and has arranged their inner life accordingly. His family is in the fog, or was. The specific thing that the fog did to Boletaria's ordinary people, to the people who had not been warriors or sorcerers or heroes, who had simply been living their lives in a kingdom that was suddenly no longer a kingdom, is present in Thomas in the most compressed possible form. Everything he had was taken. He is still here. He has a function. Sage Urbain, and the church's response, Saint Urbain, the highly respected man of great spiritual knowledge, and an abundance of faith, who the Boletarian church had considered to be in direct communion with God, through whom the faithful had believed God's message was delivered. His position in the church was not simply institutional. It was the specific claim of genuine divine connection that made him spiritually authoritative. He entered the fog, not to fight, to understand, to perform the specific function of a religious leader who believes that catastrophe is a test, and that the appropriate response to tests is to be present in them. Urbain's theology holds that the demons were placed into Boletaria as a trial from God, and that all must use God's miracles to banish the soul-hungry horde. This is the reading of the second scourge that is most comfortable for the church tradition. Urbain represents not a random catastrophe, not the consequence of a king's moral failure, not the specific result of forbidden practices, awakening something that should have stayed asleep, a test, something that God had sent for a specific purpose, that had an appropriate response, that would be survived if the response was correct. Whether this is true, whether the Old One is actually a divine instrument being deployed for divine purposes, or simply a hungry entity whose appetite is being rationalized as purposeful by the tradition that encountered it, is the ambiguity that Allant's own theological position complicates directly. Allant believed the Old One was a merciful gift from God. Urbain believed the demons were a test from God. Both were using God to make sense of the same catastrophe. Both were drawing on the same religious tradition to arrive at opposite practical conclusions. One had awakened the Old One believing he was delivering mercy. The other was fighting the Old One's demons, believing he was passing a test. The Talisman of Beasts, a specific item found in the game, contains a detail that the law uses to introduce the most unsettling possibility about the relationship between God and the Old One. It states that the symbol of God was nothing more than the image of the Old One. If this is accurate, if the God that Boletaria had been worshipping across generations was either the Old One itself or had been shaped by the Old One's influence on the tradition, then both Allant's mercy and Urbain's test were organized around a divine reference point that the Old One had manufactured or corrupted. This is the specific theological vertigo that Demon Souls produces through its most carefully placed item descriptions. The church that opposed the Old One's awakening may have been worshipping what awoke it. Urbain is found imprisoned in the Tower of Latria. The mind flayers of the former prison had captured him. The specific targeting of someone whose spiritual function made him a particular resource for the Old One's servants, whose connection to the Nexus made his imprisonment in the fog's most psychically dangerous region a specific act of deliberate cruelty. Rescuing him is possible. What he offers after rescue, the miracles of his tradition, the specific healing and protective capabilities of the church's magic, was part of what had made Boletaria able to function before the fog. Sage Freak the Visionary, the scholar who came for the knowledge. Freak the Visionary entered the fog from the perspective of a specific intellectual interest in what the soul arts actually were, in the academic understanding of the magic system that Allant had reintroduced to Boletaria, and that had produced the second scourge. He wanted to understand, not to deploy the soul arts for power, not to use them in the way that their overuse had awakened the Old One, but to comprehend the specific mechanism of what souls were and what the arts that manipulated them revealed about the nature of existence. He and Urbain occupied opposite positions in the Nexus's intellectual life. Both were scholars of their respective traditions, freak of the soul arts academic investigation, urbane of the Church's theological framework. Both were trying to make sense of the Second Scourge through the specific lens their tradition provided. Their disagreements were not simple differences of opinion. They were the collision of two incompatible frameworks for understanding the same reality. Freaky believed that knowledge of the soul arts, including the most dangerous knowledge, the specific understanding of what had been used to awaken the Old One, was worth having, that the correct response to a dangerous power is to understand it rather than to prohibit it, because prohibition does not eliminate what it prohibits, and understanding provides the specific capacity to address what prohibition simply tries to prevent. Urbane believed that the soul arts were the problem, that the specific prohibition that had been in place after the First Scourge had been correct, that Allant's revival of them had been the cause of the Second Scourge, and that Freaky's desire to understand them was the specific kind of intellectual hubris that had produced the catastrophe in the first place. They were both finding pieces of the truth. Freak's intellectual engagement with the soul arts produced genuine understanding of what they were. Urbane's moral framework for why they should be suppressed aligned with the specific institutional memory that the Monumentals had been trying to preserve before that memory faded. Neither had the complete picture. The game does not resolve the argument between them. It lets them make their cases. It trusts the player to understand that both the desire to know and the desire to suppress can be expressions of genuine concern, and that the specific shape of the problem that produced the Second Scourge does not have a clean resolution. The sixth Saint Astrea, the most unexpected figure in Demon Soul's Valley of Defilement, a maiden, specifically the sixth saint, a divine figure, worshipped for her purity. One of the most revered spiritual figures in Boletaria's church tradition, she went to the Valley of Defilement voluntarily, not to fight, not to test herself against the fog's specific expression in the lowest, most abandoned place in Boletaria's geography. She went because the people who lived in the valley were suffering, and they had been suffering long before the fog arrived. And when the fog came, it was the specific overwhelming of people who had already been at the bottom. She used a demon's soul to help them. This is the specific detail that makes Astrea's story the most morally complex thing in Demon Soul's main questline. To help the people of the Valley of Defilement, to provide the specific relief that their situation required. She used the power that Urbane's tradition had declared corrupt, and that the Monumentals' prohibition had tried to prevent. She used a demon's soul because it was the only power available that was sufficient for what she needed to do. She became the archdemon of the Valley of Defilement, not because she sought power, or because the soul arts crushed her through the specific mechanism of gradual moral decline, because helping the people in the valley required the specific power that the forbidden arts provided, and she had chosen the people over the prohibition. Her knight, Garl Vinland, stood between her and anyone who would harm her, not the fog's demon, a human knight in full armor, carrying the specific loyalty of someone who had followed the sixth saint into the most forsaken place in Boletaria, and had not left when the situation clarified what it required of him. He fights the slayer of demons to protect her. When Garl Vinland is defeated, Astrea does not fight. She speaks. She explains herself, not to justify, but to make the specific decision comprehensible to someone who has come to kill her for having made it. She had been told to minister to the people. She had found people who needed ministering to, in a place that no one else was willing to go. The demon soul that made her an archdemon was also the demon's soul that gave her the power to help them. She kills herself when Gaal is defeated, the specific act of a person whose reason for being present in a terrible place was the protection of a specific person who finds that protection no longer possible. Not despair, exactly, the specific completion of something that had been organized around, a purpose that was no longer available. The law does not tell you whether she was right. It presents what she did clearly enough that the player understands it, then puts the player in the position of having killed Gaal Vinland to reach her and heard her explanation and watched her die. The ethical weight of the moment is present without a verdict. Beor of the Twin Fangs, one of the two royal Twin Fangs, the brothers who were among Allant's finest knights, one of whom had escaped the fog and told the world what Boletaria had become. Beor was the one who hadn't escaped. He was captured, imprisoned in the dungeons of the Boletarian palace, surviving in the fog for the duration of the Second Scourge, without either dying in the conventional senses or finding a way out. He is found in a jail cell near the Tower Knight in the palace's second area. Rescuing him produces one of the game's more straightforwardly positive moments. A knight who has been imprisoned, freed, then appears to assist the slayer of demons in a subsequent encounter. He carries the specific weight of a professional soldier who had been doing his job when everything went wrong, who had not chosen to be in the position he was in, and who responds to freedom with the direct practical action of someone for whom having a task is a form of restoration. His brother Valafax, the one who escaped, is not present in the game in the same way. He is present as the specific reason the rest of the world knows about Boletaria. The law preserves his escape as the game's only example of someone successfully leaving the fog rather than being trapped in it, whatever it cost him to push through the deep fog. Whatever the specific feat required to break through a barrier that had stopped every other warrior who entered is documented by his absence from the fog's population. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and the Archdemons are waiting in their domains. The Archdemons are the specific mechanism by which the Old One maintains its presence in the 5 regions of Boletaria that the Slayer of Demons must traverse. Not simply powerful enemies, anchors, the specific concentrations of the Old One's power that hold the fog in each area, that organize the demonic presence in each region, that must be destroyed before the path to the Old One itself can be fully opened. Each Archdemon was something before the fog, or was built from something that had existed before, from the corruption of specific beings, or the transformation of specific forces that the Second Scourge had encountered in each region. Understanding what they are is inseparable from understanding what they had been, and what they had been is inseparable from understanding what the fog does to the world it moves through. Tonight, we follow the Archdemons specifically, who they are, what they represent, and what the Slayer of Demons does by defeating them. Phalanx, the wall of flesh, the first archdemon most players encounter, not the most powerful, not the most thematically complex, but the specific one whose defeat begins the sequence that the game's entire structure is organized around. Phalanx occupies the Boletarian Palace's first area, the most immediately accessible region from the Nexus, the specific entry point for warriors who enter. The fog is an organism, not a transformed human or a corrupted hero, a creature that the Old One generated from the fog's material, whose specific form, a cluster of individual slug-like organisms that merge into a larger defensive structure, reflects the Old One's approach to creating entities that serve its purposes. The specific challenge of Phalanx is not in its raw power. It is in the specific defensive arrangement of the individual organisms that constitute it. The wall of shadow lurkers, each one protecting the others, the cluster structure that makes the whole more resilient than any individual part. It fights by being a system rather than a warrior. The Old One, whose own nature is more system than individual, had expressed this quality in its first archdemon. Defeating Phalanx opens the passage further into the palace, allows the Slayer to push deeper into the first world. Its demon soul, absorbed by the Slayer of demons, adds to the accumulated power that the Maiden in Black can channel into the Slayer's growth. This is the game's specific mechanics expression of what the narrative describes. The Slayer grows stronger by consuming the specific power that the Old One had distributed into its archdemons. Tower Knight. The hollow fortress, the Tower Knight, the enormous armoured figure that guards the entrance to the Boletarian palace's inner chambers. A figure that, at first glance, appears to be a warrior in very large armour and reveals itself, as the encounter progresses, to be something more complicated. The Tower Knight is hollow. The armour is real, the scale is real, the physical threat is real. The enormous lance and the massive shield, and the specific challenge of confronting something that large in the confined space of a palace gateway, but the being inside the armour is not what it appears. The Tower Knight is not a corrupted warrior who was once a person. It is a constructed entity, a demon assembled around the specific authority of a guardian post, given physical form by the Old One's power, and set to protect what the Old One needed protected. This is one of the recurring qualities of the Boletarian Palace Archdemons, pseudo-Archdemons. They are organized around the specific military and institutional roles that the palace had been structured around before the fog. Phalanx guards the outer approach. Tower Knight guards the inner gateway. The flying exploding catapult occupies the castle walls. They are the fogs of a functioning fortress's defensive architecture, constructed from demonic power in the shapes that the fortress's function had required. The Tower Knight's weakness is its ankles. This is both a practical game mechanic detail and a thematic one. The enormous, constructed guardian, invulnerable at its most defended points, is fragile at the specific physical junctures that connect the impressive upper structure to the ground it stands on. The Tower Knight can be defeated by addressing what the armor does not protect rather than what it does. Armor Spider, the Forge's corruption. In the Stonefang Tunnel, the industrial heart of Boletaria's mining operations, the Armor Spider, the massive arachnid that occupies the tunnel's deepest accessible point before Flammelurker's domain. The Armor Spider is associated with the Forge, the specific industrial process of Stonefang, the smelting and forging and processing that had been the tunnel's function before the fog had been corrupted by the Old One's presence into something that produced the Armor Spider rather than the tools and weapons that the miners had been making. The hot metal, the fire, the specific transformation of raw material into something useful through heat. All of it expressed in demonic form as a creature of fire and steel that protected the deeper parts of the tunnel. The miners who still chisel away at the tunnel walls do not seem to notice the Armor Spider's presence in the way that living beings would notice a giant fire-breathing spider occupying the space they are working in. The specific quality of beings who have lost their souls and are simply continuing the routines of their previous existence. They continue those routines regardless of what has occupied the environment around them. Flammelurker, the Archdemon of Stonefang, not named prominently in the game's main quest description of the Archdemons, but present as one of the most demanding encounters in the entire game. A creature of fire and demonic energy, whose specific aggressive combat style and resistance to many conventional damage types made it one of the most significant mechanical challenges the Slayer of Demons faced. The Dragon God, accessible after Flammelurker, the massive, ancient dragon, or the fossil of one, or the demonic echo of one, that occupies the deepest chamber of Stonefang Tunnel in the specific form of something so large that the encounter's mechanics are organized around circumventing its direct power rather than engaging it conventionally. You cannot simply fight the Dragon God. You work around it, advance through its space, while it attempts to destroy you from above. Reach the specific points that allow you to restrain it. The Dragon God is the First Scourge in some specific sense, the ancient power that was present in the world before Allant, preserved in the tunnel where the fog had found it and incorporated it into the Second Scourge's architecture. Fool's Idol, the prison's false god in the Tower of Latria, the former prison that now housed the Mind Flayers, and the specific horror of a place designed for captivity whose demonic occupation had given that captivity a soul-consuming dimension. The Fool's Idol occupies the ritual space at the prison's center, a golden figure, beautiful and serene and completely false, not a god, a constructed effigy that the Mind Flayers had elevated as the specific object around which the prisoner's remaining consciousness was organized. The specific cruelty of the Tower of Latria Artria's Archdemon is that it is a lie. The prisoners and the Mind Flayers have organized around an idol that was created to be worshipped rather than a being with any genuine divine quality. This connects to the specific theological vertigo that the Talisman of Beasts had introduced, a constructed idol elevated to the status of a god. The specific mechanism by which a false divine object is made to serve the purposes of the power that constructed it. The Fool's Idol is the Old One's version of what the Talisman of Beasts implied the genuine church might already be. The Fool's Idol had a specific mechanic that made it one of the more unusual encounters in the game. It could be reborn repeatedly during the fight, not simply regenerating health, fully reconstituting, returning from apparent defeat, while the specific figure behind the altar that had been enabling the rebirth remained alive. The idol's defeat required addressing both the apparent enemy and the hidden source of its persistence. The metaphor is not subtle. The false god is maintained by something hidden, something that continues its function, regardless of how many times the god is apparently destroyed, attacking only what is visible. Only the idol's golden form produces repeated failures. The actual resolution required finding and addressing the specific hidden mechanism that made the false god possible. Manita, the optional encounter before the Fool's Idol's domain, the gargoyle-like creatures that occupied the open platforms above the prison, threatening, swift, and specifically designed to use the architecture against the player by attacking from angles that the confined space of the platform made difficult to defend against. Fighting both simultaneously was one of the game's most challenging optional encounters for players who approached it unprepared. Old Monk and the latent threat. The Old Monk, the figure who occupied the Tower of Latria's upper reaches and served as the region's primary archdemon, not a demon in the direct sense, or rather, a demon in the specific sense of a human who had been consumed by the Old One's influence in a way that made them something other than what they had been without eliminating their human form. An old man, presumably a monk of the church, given the specific designation, whose specific corruption had made him the vessel through which the Mind Flayers' operations were organized, and through whom the Latria region was anchored to the Old One's power. the robes of the old monk, the talisman of beasts, items associated with him that contained the most theologically unsettling details about the relationship between the Church's God and the Old One, his specific unique mechanic in the original game. The encounter with the old monk summoned a human invader to fight in his place when the player was connected to the online network, not a pre-programmed AI opponent. Another player, controlling the old monk's form, using the specific capabilities of a human player against another human player. The encounter's challenge was variable and specifically human rather than specifically designed. In the remake and offline play, an AI equivalent fills the role. This mechanic reflected something specific about the Tower of Latria's nature. The fog did not simply produce fixed obstacles. It incorporated the specific quality of human aggression and human capability into the specific threat that each region produced. Storm King, the natural world corrupted. In the Shrine of Storms, the ancient burial ground where the dead of the pre-fog world had been interred. A location with the specific quality of a place that had always been in proximity to the boundary between the living and the dead, that had been organized around the specific practices of honoring what those boundaries meant. The Storm King was not a figure of the church or the palace or the mining operations or the prison. It was a creature of the sky, the massive stingray-like demon that dominated the open space above the shrine's landscape, whose specific approach to the encounter it provided was not conventional combat, but the specific terror of something enormous and aerial, whose natural element was not where the player could effectively fight. The shadow lurkers and the shadow men that populated the shrine were organized around the specific ritual relationship to the dead that the shrine had always had, not the fog's transformation of warriors or workers or scholars, but the fog's transformation of the specific tradition of relating to the departed. The shrine's population had been changed by what the fog had brought to a place that was already organized around death, and what had been honored had become predatory. Defeating the Storm King required finding the specific weapon that could address it in its element. The Storm Ruler, a sword that channeled the same wind energy that the Storm King commanded, that could be used to strike from ranges that the direct confrontation with something that large could not otherwise achieve. The weapon was in the shrine itself, near the Storm King's domain, placed there by the fog, or by the Old One, or by whatever force had arranged the specific architecture of each region's challenge. Leechmonger and Maiden Astrea, in the Valley of Defilement, the two archdemons of the lowest, most abandoned region of Boletaria, and the two that most clearly illustrated the range of what an archdemon could be. Leechmonger, a creature of biological horror, a mass of writhing organisms, leech-based, organized around the specific properties of the valley's diseased and abandoned landscape. The Leechmonger is not a corrupted person. It is the valley's own character, the specific biological expression of a place that had always been at the margins of human habitation, that had always been associated with disease and abandonment. Given demonic amplification by the fog, it could heal from the bodies of those near it. The specific ecological logic of a leech-based organism expressed through the Old One's enhancement, consuming the soul energy of whatever was in its vicinity to replenish what had been depleted, fighting the Leechmonger in its own territory, surrounded by the valley's population of other demons and the specific environmental hazard of the valley's poisonous ground, was one of the Second Scourge most purely hostile environments. Maiden Astrea, already described in the previous section through her specific story, the saint who went to the valley voluntarily, who used a demon's soul to help the people there, who had become an archdemon through the specific mechanism of caring for those who needed care in the only way available to her. The encounter with Astrea is the moral center of Demon Soul's questline. The Slayer of Demons, following the Monumentals' instructions to destroy all the archdemons, reaches a being who is an archdemon because she was trying to be a saint, who explains herself without asking for mercy, who dies without asking to be saved. Every other archdemon in the game is clearly something that should be destroyed. A manifestation of the Old One's power, a source of demonic corruption, an anchor for the fog in a specific region. Astrea is an archdemon who was doing something that the church she came from would have recognized as her vocation, using means that same church had condemned. The game requires you to kill her to proceed. It does not pretend this is without cost. The specific weight of the Maiden Astrea encounter, the weight that players who engage with the law carry out of the Valley of Defilement, is one of Demon Soul's most deliberately produced effects. What defeating the archdemons means. When all 5 archdemons were defeated, when the Slayer of Demons had collected their souls and grown strong enough through the accumulated power of what they had consumed, the seal that kept the Old One's innermost domain inaccessible broke. The path opened, not through the fog, not through the specific regional structure that the archdemons had been anchoring, through the bottom of the Nexus itself, the specific passage that led downward to where the Old One slept, and where the true King Allant waited inside it. The Maiden in Black led the Slayer of Demons down, the 5 archdemon souls, each one a piece of the Old One's distributed power, each one a fragment of the specific entity's presence in the world, had been consumed by the Slayer. The accumulated weight of everything the second Scourge had produced converted into the strength that the Slayer of Demons would need for what came next. Below the Nexus, in the space that the Nexus had been built to contain, the Old One waited. King Allant waited within it. The choice that the game had been building toward waited at the end of both. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and the Old One is not far away. Before following the Slayer of Demons into the Old One's depths, before the encounter with the true King Allant, and the choice that ends the game, there is a specific set of objects in Demon Soul's world that deserve their own night. Not because they are the most powerful items in the game, though the combined Northern Regalia is among the most potent weapons available, because they are the specific objects through which Demon Souls expresses its most compressed statement about what souls are and what people do with them. The Soulbrandt and the Demonbrandt, 2 swords, 2 halves of a single weapon, the Northern Regalia, the royal treasure of the Allant family dynasty, 2 diametrically opposed expressions of how the power of souls can be used. Tonight we follow these blades and what they reveal about the world they exist in. The Northern Regalia. The origin story of the Northern Regalia runs deeper than King Allant XII. It runs through his entire family lineage, through the dynasty that had governed Boletaria for generations before Allant XII came to the throne, back to the specific moment when the weapon was created. The Northern Regalia was described as a 2-handed enchanted sword of unrivaled power believed to have been created by God. This attribution, the specific claim that the weapon was divine in origin, situates it within the same theological framework that the Talisman of Beasts had complicated. If God created it, and if the Talisman of Beasts was right, that the symbol of God was the image of the Old One, then the origin of the Allant family's royal treasure is considerably more ambiguous than simple divine blessing. The sword could be split into two separate one-handed swords. The Northern Regalia's most important property was this. It was not simply a powerful weapon, but a weapon that expressed a fundamental division in how souls could be used. In physical form that could be held and fought with and observed, Soulbrandt represented the sinful path chosen by those who coveted the souls of others for greater power. The blade could cut directly into the soul of an opponent, not simply damage the body, but damage what animated the body, what made the body a person rather than simply matter. It strengthened in the hands of a wielder who used it for evil purposes. Allant XII had favored Soulbrandt because of its innate connection to the dark side of human existence. Its power rose the more demonic one's soul became. Demonbrandt's power increased the more pure one's soul became. The inverse expression. The same fundamental resource deployed in the opposite direction. The soul power that flowed through both blades, differentiated entirely by the moral quality of the person wielding it. A pure soul made Demonbrandt more powerful. A corrupted soul made Soulbrandt more powerful. Together, as the Northern Regalia, they were the most powerful weapon in Boletaria, requiring both a pure soul and a corrupted soul to reach maximum capability. Their combined form worked only by someone who had engaged with both aspects of what the power of souls could produce. What the two blades say about souls, the fundamental statement that the Soulbrandt and Demonbrandt expressed together. Souls can be used for both light and darkness, and the person who uses them shapes what they become. This seems simple. It has specific implications that run through the entire game's moral structure. The power of souls is neutral. The Old One's power, the Archdemon's souls, the demon's souls that the Slayer collects, all of it is the same substance, the same fundamental material of which living existence is made. What determines whether it serves light or darkness is what the person who channels it intends. Urbane's miracles draw on God's power, which may be the Old One's power, and produce healing and protection. Freak's soul arts draw on the same fundamental resource and produce offensive capability and knowledge. The false king fought with the Soulbrandt's specific soul-cutting capability. Astrea used a demon's soul to protect the people of the valley. The substance is the same, the use differs, and the Demonbrandt and Soulbrandt are the physical expression of this. Two weapons made from the same origin, growing stronger through opposite qualities of the soul that uses them, reuniting into their greatest form only in a being who has engaged with both. King Allant's choice of Soulbrandt. The law notes specifically that King Allant favored Soulbrandt. It notes his affinity for the dark side of human existence, the specific quality of someone who was drawn to the acknowledgement of what darkness was rather than the performance of light that the Demonbrandt's growth through purity would have required. This is not simply character flavor. It is a specific clue to the trajectory of Allant's moral development, to the particular direction that the melancholy of his old age had been pulling him. A person who favors Soulbrandt is a person who is drawn to honesty about darkness rather than aspiration toward light. This quality has two expressions. One is the specific kind of realism that sees suffering clearly and does not minimize it, that Allant's theological position was built on. The other is the specific kind of corruption that uses that realism as the justification for actions that the denial of light enables. Allant had both. The observation of suffering that had driven him to melancholy was genuine. The conclusion he drew from it, that ending existence was mercy, required the specific step of choosing the Soulbrandt's logic over the Demonbrandts, choosing to act on the darkness that was real, rather than aspiring toward the light that was also real. When he returned to the Nexus with Soulbrandt in hand to awaken the Old One, he was using the weapon that expressed the specific moral choice he had made. Not simply carrying the stronger sword, bodying the specific path that the weapon represented. The Ostrava connection, Ostrava of Boletaria, the Prince of Boletaria, whose real name is Ariona Allant, who is the son of King Allant XII, and who appears throughout the Boletarian palace as an NPC that the Slayer of Demons encounters repeatedly across the region's 3 areas. He does not know his father's role in the Second Scourge. This is the specific quality of Ostrava's situation that makes it one of the game's most affecting character arcs. He entered the fog to find his father, to investigate the rumors of what the king had done, carrying the specific loyalty of a son who wanted to believe that the worst version of the story was not the true one. The game allows him to die. If the Slayer of Demons does not intervene at specific moments when he is in danger, Ostrava is killed by the fog's demons before reaching the truth he is looking for. If the Slayer helps him through each encounter, clearing the enemies that would have killed him, ensuring he can continue his search, he reaches the gates of the Boletarian Palace's innermost area and confronts the specific reality of what his father had done. He kills himself. The specific action of a person who has been looking for a version of the truth he could live with and has found the version that is true and cannot accept it. He leaves behind the mausoleum key, the item that grants access to King Allant's personal quarters, the specific location where the Soulbrandt can be found, and where the most direct material evidence of what Allant had chosen is preserved. Ostrava's arc is one of the game's most compressed tragedies. The son who came to find his father found what his father had become and could not go on. The Soulbrandt that his father had favored was in his father's quarters, waiting for the Slayer of Demons to collect it. Ostrava's death is what made the collection possible. The Maiden in Black and Soul channeling. The Maiden in Black's specific function in the Nexus, the act of channeling souls into the Slayer's growth, is not simply a game mechanic. It is the specific expression of the same soul manipulation that the soul arts had always represented, performed by the being who had taught King Allant those arts, in service of the specific goal of enabling the Slayer to address the consequences of what Allant had done with what she taught him. She channels demon souls, the specific souls of the Archdemons that the Slayer of the Demons collects, each one a piece of the Old One's distributed power. She takes and transforms into growth. The mechanism is the same as the soul arts that had been banned after the First Scourge, the manipulation of soul substance to produce capability in the person who wields it. The Maiden in Black is the one doing the channeling, not the Slayer. Whether this distinction matters, whether using the Maiden in Black's specific channeling ability to grow stronger, constitutes the same kind of soul arts usage that had awakened the Old One, or whether her specific nature as a demon of the Nexus made her channeling something different from the human soul arts practice that the Monumentals prohibition had targeted, is a question the game raises and does not answer. It is possible that the Slayer of Demons is awakening the Old One more deeply with every soul channeled. The crestfallen warrior's theory that the Monumentals were using the Slayer to deal with their own mistake did not address the possibility that the Slayer's own growth might be contributing to the problem they were supposed to solve. Or it is possible that the Maiden's specific channeling was always the appropriate mechanism, the specific thing that was supposed to happen, that had been a practical measure rather than a metaphysical principle, that growing stronger through the Maiden's guidance, was genuinely different from the soul arts that had been misused. The game does not resolve this. The Maiden in Black is not interrogable about the nature of what she is doing. She is present. She channels, the Slayer grows, the Archdemons are defeated. Whether the process that enabled the defeat was itself a contributing factor to the condition requiring the defeat. This remains as the specific question that the game's most careful players carry through to the ending. The colorless demon souls. Among the souls the Slayer of Demons could collect, the colorless demon souls occupied a specific category, not attached to a specific demon, not the direct product of an archdemon's defeat, but the raw soul substance extracted from specific enemies in specific circumstances. The specific distillation of what the fog was made of, in a form that could be exchanged for capability, rather than consumed as power. The colorless demon souls are the most direct expression of the fog's specific substance. The fog is not simply a weather condition or a magical effect. It is made of soul material, the specific substance that the Old One consumes, and that the soul arts manipulate. The colorless demon souls collected from certain enemies in the Shrine of Storms and other locations were, in a specific sense, pieces of the Old One's presence in the world, extracted into manipulable form. What the player could do with them, exchange them with specific NPCs for specific capabilities, was the specific economy that the fog's soul substance enabled. The Slayer of Demons was not simply fighting through the fog. They were participating in the specific economy of souls that the Old One's awakening had produced, using the fog's own substance to become capable enough to address the fog. Yurt the Silent Chief, one of the warriors who entered the fog for reasons that were not heroic. Yurt, an assassin described as such in the lore, had come to Boletaria for the specific purpose of killing, not the fog's demons, not the archdemons, the people in the Nexus, specifically those with knowledge of the soul arts. He worked alongside Mephistopheles, the enigmatic figure who appears in a specific optional questline, and whose specific goals involved eliminating everyone in the Nexus who had knowledge of the soul arts. The Order of the Soul, the organization behind this purging, had determined that removing the soul arts practitioners from Boletaria was necessary to keep the specific practice secret. Whether the Order of the Soul's motives were protective, trying to prevent further awakening of the Old One by eliminating those who could teach the arts, or sinister, trying to maintain exclusive control over the specific knowledge for their own purposes, is one of the game's maintained ambiguities. The mechanism of their action was assassination. The specific targets were the scholars and practitioners in the Nexus, including Sage Freak. Yurt is found imprisoned in a hanging cage in the Tower of Latria. Rescuing him, without knowing who he is, produces the specific consequence of releasing someone who then immediately begins killing the people who had been present in the Nexus helping the Slayer of Demons. The specific cruelty of this, the way the game makes a well-intentioned action produce a harmful outcome, is characteristic of Demon Soul's approach to moral complexity. He is patient. He does not kill immediately. He waits and kills one NPC at a time between the player's visits to the Nexus, creating the specific discovery of finding someone missing rather than the immediate horror of witnessing a killing. The gap between action and consequence, between the decision to rescue him and the discovery of what that decision produced, is where the game places the emotional weight. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and the choice is approaching. The false King Allant is dead. the demon that the true king had fashioned in his own likeness, the specific construct that had been leading the demonic armies that had been wearing the appearance of Boletaria's king while the actual king dissolved inside the old one, has been defeated by the slayer of demons. The palace is accessible in full. The path downward through the Nexus and into the old one's domain is open. What the slayer of demons finds inside the old one is not what the game's opening description of King Allant XII had prepared them for. Not a tyrant, not a monster in the simple sense of something that chose evil from available options. Something worse in the specific way that tragic endings are worse than villainous ones. A being whose transformation into what the old one had made of him was the specific consequence of a choice that the game had given the player enough information to understand. Tonight we follow the true King Allant, his appearance in the old one's depths, his final words, what he had become and what that becoming means. Inside the old one's exterior, what the player approaches after defeating all 5 Archdemons and descending with the Maiden in black through the bottom of the Nexus, is not the conventional architecture of a final dungeon. It is a desert, a vast open space of pale sand, under a sky that has the specific quality of something that is neither inside nor outside, neither day nor night. A beach in the middle of a desert, accessible from the Nexus only after the path through the Archdemons has been cleared. The old one itself is barely visible in the conventional sense. There is no imposing form to see, no dragon scale or demonic shape that corresponds to the threat that the entire game had been building toward. There is a circular mouth, a massive opening in the sand, ringed with the specific geometry of something that is not built, but is, like the old one itself, grown. Inside the mouth, a passage. Inside the passage, a small pond. And in the pond, what remained of King Allant XII. This is the specific geographical expression of what the old one is. Not a castle or a fortress or a throne room, a body. The desert and the beach and the circular mouth are the old one's exterior. The passages within are its interior. The encounter with the true King Allant happens inside the entity that had consumed him, inside the being that his choice had merged him with, what Allant had become, an abomination of bloated brown and green flesh that was once King Allant XII. The Soulbrandt is stuck to one of its appendages. He has 2 deformed arm-like structures and a flat bottom. His body is covered in warts and tentacles. His head consists of 4 olive-coloured eyes with multiple pupils. This is the true King Allant, the king who had been magnanimous and beloved, who had fought valiantly against demons in the aftermath of the First Scourge, who had ushered in prosperity through the soul arts, who had looked at the world and found it insufficient, and made the decision that ended Boletaria, had become this. The specific form of his transformation is not arbitrary. It is the specific expression of what the old one's consumption does to someone who gives himself wholly to it, who retreats deep into it, and allows its power to remake what he was into something compatible with its nature. Allant had wanted to merge with the old one's purpose. The old one had obliged him by merging him with its substance. He cannot stand. The enormity and specificity of his transformation had eliminated the specific physical capability that a person needs to rise and move. He can drag himself along the bottom of the pond. He can speak. The distorted voice that remains is still capable of forming the specific words that the encounter requires him to say. He still carries the Soulbrandt, the sword that had been his specific choice, the blade that represented the dark side of human existence, that had been his favoured weapon because of its connection to what he was drawn to acknowledge, is embedded in one of his transformed appendages. He cannot use it. It is simply there, stuck, a remnant of who he had been, preserved in the being he had become. The final conversation. What King Allant says, when the slayer of demons reaches him inside the Old One, is the specific moment that the entire game had been building toward, not the fight. The true King Allant is not a demanding combat encounter. He is slow and has limited attacks, and can be defeated with minimal difficulty by the slayer who has reached this point. The fight is not the encounter. The words are the encounter. He tries to reason with the slayer. He explains himself, or rather, he reiterates the specific argument that his melancholy had produced, the theological position about mercy and the inevitability of suffering that had led to the Second Scourge. He claims that because of humanity's own violence and suffering, the Old One is acting mercifully by putting an end to the tragic realm of existence. He is still making the argument. The transformation has not changed his conviction. He is inside the Old One, dissolved into what the Old One had made of him, reduced to a form that cannot stand. And he still believes he was right, that the suffering the Old One's awakening had produced was preferable to the suffering that existence without the Old One's consumption would have continued to produce. This is the specific quality of the true King Allant encounter that makes it devastating rather than simply concluded. He is not broken. He is not repentant. He is not a villain who has recognized the villainy of what he did. He is a person whose conviction survived everything the Old One had done to him. Because the conviction was not about personal survival or personal benefit. It was about what he believed the world required, whether his argument was wrong, whether the specific premise of it was mistaken, whether no one wishes to go on was an accurate generalization, whether ending existence constituted mercy. The game does not resolve this in the explicit way that would make the resolution clean. It places the player in the position of having heard the argument and having to fight him anyway. He is defeated. His final words, "You fool, don't you understand? No one wishes to go on." The specific address, "You fool," directed at the person who has just defeated him, who represents the continuation of existence by virtue of being the specific person trying to ensure existence continues. The specific accusation of foolishness directed at the act of choosing to continue. His final words are not a death rattle or a villain's last curse. They are a final statement of the position that had organized his entire existence from the moment his melancholy had produced the conviction. He believed it to the end. The Old One had consumed him. He had chosen this, and he still thought it was right. The Soulbrandt and what it yielded. When the true King Allant was defeated, he dropped the Soulbrandt, the sword that had been stuck in his transformed body, that could not be used by what he had become, but that had persisted as the specific physical remnant of his identity through the transformation. The Soulbrandt recovered from inside the Old One, combined with the Demonbrandt that could be found in the Boletarian palace, produced the Northern Regalia, the weapon that represented both halves of how souls could be used. The sinful path and the pure path, the Soulbrandt and the Demonbrandt united, achievable at the specific point in the game when both parts of the story that the two blades represented had been addressed. It was the most powerful weapon available to the Slayer of Demons, appropriate in the specific irony of Demon Soul's design. The weapon that combined the sinful and the pure paths was more powerful than either alone, and it was available only at the end of a game that had been asking whether any of the available paths were adequate. What Ostrava's death made possible, the Mausoleum Key, The item that Ostrava left behind when he killed himself before the innermost palace area was what made the Soulbrandt accessible before the true king encounter. The king's personal quarters, locked behind the mausoleum's door, contained the sword that he had favored throughout his life, the specific chain. To get the Soulbrandt from the palace, the Slayer had to help Ostrava through the entire palace questline, watch him discover the truth of his father's actions, see him kill himself in response to that discovery, and use the key he had left behind to enter the space his father had reserved for himself. The son's death was what gave access to the father's most personal space. The specific grief of Ostrava's discovery was what made the Soulbrandt's recovery possible by an outside party. The room had been locked precisely to maintain the king's privacy, and the key that unlocked it was the legacy of the son who had tried to maintain the belief that his father had been something other than what he was. This is not commented on directly. The game places the elements and trusts the player to observe the connection. The mausoleum key does not announce its significance. The connection between Ostrava's death and the recovery of Allant's most personally significant weapon is simply there, in the specific arrangement of what the game required to proceed. Allant's demon, what the false king tells us, the false King Allant, the demon that the true king had created in his own likeness, tells us something specific about what Allant's power had been at its height. To create a demonized version of yourself that can lead armies and fight warriors of exceptional capability. To construct an autonomous entity that embodied your specific qualities at the moment of your greatest power required a level of mastery over the soul arts that very few beings had ever achieved. Allant at his peak was capable of this, the specific feat of self-replication, of taking the soul substance and knowledge of your own form and capabilities and concentrating it into a separate autonomous demon, was the specific application of the soul arts at the highest level the game documented any human achieving. He had been that powerful, and then he had chosen to dissolve into the old one and become what the true king encounter showed, not because the old one had overcome him, because he had given himself to it, because the power he had demonstrated by creating the false king was not the power he valued most. He valued the specific peace the old one's consumption would produce. The contrast between the false king's martial capability and the true king's helpless deformity is not simply the old one consuming what power Allant had and leaving the remainder. It is the specific expression of what Allant had prioritized. He had created the false king as his replacement in the world's functions. He had chosen to go beyond that, to go into the old one entirely, to convert himself from a king of Boletaria into a component of the entity that was going to end Boletaria. The choice was complete. The form it produced expressed its completeness. The monk and the Order of the Soul, the old monk, whose specific items contained the most theologically unsettling details about the relationship between the Church's God and the Old One, represented a strand of Boletaria's history that the main questline touched without fully developing. The Order of the Soul, the organization behind Mephistopheles and Yurt, whose specific goal of eliminating practitioners of the soul arts had sent an assassin into the fog. What the Order of the Soul was, who had founded it, what its specific relationship to the Church's theology and to the soul arts history was, whether it predated the Second Scourge or had been formed in response to it, the game does not fully specify. The Talisman of Beasts, found in the Old Monks area, contains the specific claim about God and the Old One that the Order of the Soul would presumably have had access to if the talisman was associated with them. The specific interest in eliminating soul arts practitioners might be connected to the specific knowledge of what the soul arts source actually was, to the understanding that the practice was connected to the Old One in a more direct way than its practitioners understood. If the symbol of God was, if the Church's theological framework had been organized around an entity that was either the Old One itself or had been shaped by the Old One's practitioners, might have served eliminating the Church's interest in maintaining its theological authority, or the Old One's interest in keeping the specific knowledge of that connection suppressed. The order of the soul remains one of demon souls' maintained mysteries. Its goals were clear in their immediate expression: kill people who know the soul arts, and ambiguous in their ultimate motivation. Like most of the game's most important ambiguities, the lack of resolution is not a lacuna, but a specific choice. The game is more honest about the limits of what can be known from inside the fog than it would be if it resolved everything cleanly. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the Old One is waiting for the Slayer's decision. The Maiden in Black, the figure who had been present in the Nexus since the Slayer of Demons arrived, who had greeted them at the foot of the Archstones, who had channeled the power of the Archdemons' souls into the Slayer's growth, who had led them down through the bottom of the Nexus to the Old One's domain. She has been the constant of the entire game, the specific presence that made everything else possible. Who is she? The game gives more information about the Maiden in Black than it initially appears to, distributed across item descriptions, an NPC dialogue, and the specific way that her design, the blind eyes, the fire-lit staff, the specific nation of unsettling and gentle that she embodies, communicates something about what she is before the lore explicitly states it. She is a demon. This is stated directly in the game's lore. The Maiden in Black is a demon who arrived alongside the waking of the Old One and the spread of the deep fog. Not one of the fog's created demons. Something older, something specifically positioned in the Nexus rather than dispersed through the fog's regions. A demon whose specific function was not consumption but tending. Tonight we follow the Maiden in Black, who she was before the Slayer arrived, what her specific function in the Nexus had been, what her relationship to King Allant was, and what the choice that the game ends with means for her specifically. A demon who tends. The distinction between the Maiden in Black and the demons of the fog is fundamental to understanding what Demon Souls is actually about. The fog's demons consume. They take souls, strip the animating principle from the beings they encounter, feed the Old One's appetite. This is what demons do in the game's world. This is the specific threat they represent, the specific reason that the Slayer of Demons exists, and the reason the Monumentals had maintained their vigil. The Maiden in Black sustains. She tends the candles in the Nexus, a detail so small that it would be easy to pass over, but which carries the specific weight of careful environmental storytelling. She lights them. She keeps the space between the Old One's domain and the material world bright and habitable for the souls bound there. She channels power into the Slayer's growth, rather than consuming it for the Old One. She is a demon whose specific function within the Old One's existence is, but might to manage the structure around the appetite. The Nexus required someone to maintain it, to perform the specific ritual attention that kept it functioning as the interface between the fog and the world outside it. The Maiden in Black had been that function for as long as the Nexus had existed. Whether this made her an ally in the conventional sense, whether her interests aligned with the Slayer of Demons' interests, whether the ritual she performed to lull the Old One to sleep at the game's end was something she wanted to perform, is one of the questions the game raises more clearly than it answers. She was a teacher to King Allant. This is the lore's most significant detail about the Maiden in Black. Before the Slayer arrived, when Allant discovered the Nexus and descended into it, when he found the soul arts and the specific knowledge that would eventually produce the prosperity and the catastrophe of the Second Scourge, it was the Maiden who taught him. She gave him what she had to teach. Did she know what he would do with it? The game does not say. The specific question of what the Maiden Black understood about Allant's trajectory, whether she foresaw the Second Scourge, whether she taught him deliberately as part of the Old One's plans, whether she was simply performing the function of teaching the soul arts to the person who descended and asked, remains unresolved. What is certain, the Second Scourge was enabled by what she taught. Whether she is therefore responsible for it, whether the teacher of a skill that is then misused is responsible for the misuse, is the specific ethical question that her characterization leaves open. Her blindness. The Maiden in Black's blind eyes are not simply a character detail. They carry specific meaning in Demon Soul's aesthetic vocabulary. She cannot see, or rather, she sees differently from how the living see. The firelit staff she carries illuminates the spaces around her. The candles she tends in the Nexus produce the visible light that makes the Nexus habitable. She provides light for others to see by without being able to see herself in the conventional way. This quality, tending the light that others use without benefiting from it in the same way, is a compressed expression of her function in the Nexus. She sustains the structure that everyone else operates within. She channels the power that makes the Slayer of Demons stronger. She performs the ritual that puts the Old One to sleep. All of these are functions that benefit others more directly than they benefit her. Whether this is a form of servitude, whether she was compelled to this function by the Old One's nature, assigned to the Nexus as a keeper because the Old One required someone to maintain the structure, or whether she had chosen the function, had arranged her existence around the specific task of managing the Old One's relationship to the world, is another of the maintained ambiguities. The fire staff, the specific object she carries, which she uses to channel souls into the Slayer's growth, which she carries through the descent to the Old One, which is present in every encounter with her, produces the light that the Nexus runs on. Light from the staff of a blind woman who tends the space where souls are trapped. What she said about the soul arts. The Maiden in Black's specific role in teaching King Allant the soul arts is documented through the lore, rather than through direct dialogue with the player. She does not explain herself to the Slayer of Demons in the way that some NPCs explain themselves. She provides the function she provides, and the game assembles her history through the pieces it distributes in other locations. What the lore establishes. The soul arts were not simply academic knowledge that the Maiden happened to possess and shared when asked. They were the specific practice that the Old One was the source of. The soul arts were power derived from the souls of others, and the Old One was the entity whose existence was organized around consuming souls. The two were connected at the origin. The Maiden in Black teaching the soul arts to Allant was, in some specific sense, introducing him to the practice whose overuse would awaken what she served. Whether this was the Old One's design, whether the teaching was a deliberate seduction, a specific step in the mechanism by which the Old One ensured its own periodic awakening, or whether the Maiden's teaching had been genuinely separate from the Old One's appetite, is the question that the Talisman of Beasts revelation had made most urgent. If the symbol of God was the image of the Old One, if the religion of Boletaria had been shaped by the Old One's influence, then the soul arts as divine gifts from the Nexus and the Old One, as the source of those gifts, formed a specific closed loop. The people who used the arts were using a resource provided by the entity whose awakening their use would trigger. Prosperity was real. The cost was designed. Whether the Maiden in Black was aware of this loop, whether she was an unwitting participant in a mechanism she did not design or a knowing component of a system she did, is unresolvable from the information the game provides. The descent. When the Slayer of Demons had defeated all 5 Archdemons and returned to the Nexus, the Maiden in Black guided them downward. This is the specific act of her involvement in the game's climax. Not fighting, not providing counsel, but leading. The same function she had performed by channeling the Archdemon's souls was performed here, by taking the Slayer to the place where the choice had to be made. The descent through the bottom of the Nexus into the Old One's domain was not a conventional dungeon approach. It was the Maiden in Black, performing her specific function as the person who maintained the connection between the Nexus and what was below it, who knew the way, who could navigate the passage between the world and the Old One's interior. She did not explain what would happen next. She did not tell the Slayer what the choice would be, or what she would do when they arrived. She simply led, as she had been leading since the beginning, with the specific, quiet purpose of being performing the function they had always performed. Inside the Old One, after the true King Allant was defeated, she arrived. She called out to the Old One, not with commands, not with the authority of someone directing a lesser entity, with the specific call of someone performing a ritual, beckoning, inviting, specific sounds and gestures that constitute the ritual of lulling the Old One back to sleep. The Old One responded. It invited the Slayer inside, an invitation that the game framed as the temptation of the bad ending, the specific seduction that Allant had succumbed to, and that the Slayer could choose to follow or refuse. The Old One extended the same offer it had extended to Allant. Come inside. Give yourself to what I am. Let the consuming be complete rather than partial. What the ritual cost? The lulling ritual. The Maiden's specific act of singing or calling the Old One back to sleep was not without cost. The game is not explicit about this, but the Maiden's appearance and the specific nature of her function suggests that the ritual had a personal dimension beyond simple performance. She had been doing this for the Old One's entire history, or for the history of the Nexus, at minimum. For as long as the structure had existed, the Maiden had been its keeper, performing the specific function that the structure required. The First Scourge had been ended by a lulling. The Second Scourge would be ended by a lulling, both endings passing through her, whether she was exhausted by this, whether the specific weight of maintaining the vigil across however long the Nexus had existed, had produced something in her that the game's characterization expressed through the specific quality of her presence is not something the dialogue or item descriptions confirm. She is present. She's performing her function. She does not express what it has cost, what the player can observe. She is not asking to be freed. The Maiden in Black unlike Gammon in Bloodborne's equivalent final moment, does not indicate a desire to be released from the function she has been performing, whether this is because the function is genuinely her purpose, because she is, in the specific sense that some beings are defined by what they do, the Maiden, who tends the Nexus, and that is what she is, or because she has been in this role long enough that no alternative presents itself as comprehensible. The game does not say what she was before the Old One woke. The Maiden in Black arrived alongside the waking of the Old One and the spread of the deep fog. This is the law's specific statement about when she appeared in relation to the events the game depicted. She was not present in Boletaria before Allant awakened the Old One, or at least her presence in the Nexus was not documented before the Second Scourge. This raises a specific question about the First Scourge. If the Maiden in Black arrived with the Second Scourge's awakening, then the lulling of the First Scourge was performed by someone or something else. Or the Maiden arrived with the Old One's first awakening in the distant past and remained in the Nexus through the long period between the Scourges. The law's statement is ambiguous on this point. Arrived alongside the waking could mean the Second Scourge specifically, or the Old One's awakening in general. Either of the two times the Old One had been roused, the gap between Scourges, during which she would have been in the Nexus maintaining the structure around a sleeping Old One, is not documented through any available source. What it means for the game's present. She has been in the Nexus through at least the entire period of the Second Scourge. She was there when Allant arrived. She was there when the fog spread and Boletaria fell, and warriors entered the fog and were bound by the Nexial binding. She is there when the Slayer of Demons arrives and when the choice is made at the end. She is the one constant in every version of this story. The being who had been present for both the causing and the correcting, who had taught Allant and who would lull what Allant woke back to sleep, who would continue tending the Nexus after the Slayer of Demons had made their choice and the game had ended. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the choice is waiting at the Old One's threshold. This is the final part. Let everything slow. We have followed Boletaria from the First Scourge through the centuries of prohibition and forgetting, through King Allant XII's discovery of the Nexus, the soul arts, and the specific melancholy that produced the Second Scourge, through the 5 regions and the people who had been trapped in the fog, through the Archdemons and the false king and the true king inside the Old One. Everything has led to this. The Maiden in Black has performed her ritual. The Old One is stirring in response to the call. The true King Allant is defeated. The Slayer of Demons stands at the specific threshold that the entire game had been building toward. 2 choices, 2 outcomes, one more honest than the other about what the world that follows each one will be. The good ending. The Slayer of Demons walks away. They leave the Old One's interior while the Maiden in Black performs the ritual, while the lulling takes effect, while the specific mechanism that had ended the First Scourge, and that the game had identified as the appropriate response to the Second Scourge, completes itself. The fog lifts. Boletaria is visible again from the outside world, not restored to what it was before the Second Scourge, not cleansed of the damage that the fog had done, but no longer cut off. The colourless deep fog that had isolated the kingdom from the world recedes. The specific barrier that had been both the fog's immediate expression and the mechanism by which those inside it could not leave or communicate with those outside dissolves. Those who had been in the Nexus are freed. The Nexial binding that had trapped their souls, the mechanism by which the Monumental had bound them, the thing that the crestfallen warrior had spent his time in the Nexus being bitter about, is released. The specific people the player had encountered, Thomas the Stoic, Sage Urbane, Sage Frake, Bior, whatever of them remained after the game's choices and Yurt's possible murders, are freed from the trap they had been in. The Slayer of Demons is hailed as the hero of a restored, though damaged, Boletaria. This specific phrasing matters. The game does not pretend that what the Second Scourge had done could be undone simply by lulling the old one back to sleep. The damage was real. The people who had died in the fog, whose souls had been consumed, who had been transformed, who had been killed in the specific way of a kingdom that had experienced a catastrophe of this magnitude, were gone. The mining tunnels of Stonefang were still populated by soulless miners who continued to chisel at the walls. The Valley of Defilement was still the Valley of Defilement. The restoration was not a reversal, it was a cessation. The fog stopped spreading. What it had already done remained done. The Slayer of Demons becomes a new monumental to support the world as the knowledge of soul arts is lost. This is the specific form of the good ending's conclusion. The hero who had cleared the way for the world's restoration is bound to the same vigil that had sustained the prohibition after the First Scourge, not simply celebrated and released, tied to the Nexus, half-living, a new member of the tradition that had been losing members since the First Scourge had been addressed, and whose last representative had barely maintained the vigil long enough for the Second Scourge to be ended. The good ending is good in the specific limited sense that the world continues. The old one sleeps. The fog recedes. People who had been trapped are freed. The hero takes on the burden of the long watch. None of this is without cost. The hero's freedom is the first thing sacrificed. The world's memory of the soul arts is the second. The knowledge of the specific practice that had been Boletaria's prosperity and its destruction, lost again, as it had been lost after the First Scourge, as it would presumably be found again by the next person who descended into the Nexus and learned what the Maiden in Black had to teach. The cycle would repeat. The game is honest about this. The specific ending does not prevent the Third Scourge. It delays it. Someone else will eventually find the Nexus. Someone else will learn the soul arts. Someone else will use them until the threshold is reached. The old one will wake again. The new Monumental's job is to ensure the structure is maintained until that happens, to sustain the vigil that had been sustained between the First and Second Scourges, to be present when the next Slayer of Demons arrives and needs to be told what to do, to be what the last Monumental had been, the one who remained. The bad ending, the Slayer of Demons kills the Maiden in Black before she can complete the lulling ritual, before the old one can be returned to sleep. The Slayer turns on the person who had guided them through everything.
Yeah.
The blind woman who had tended the Nexus's candles, who had channeled the power of the Archdemons' souls into growth, who had led them to the threshold, and kills her. The game treats this as the seduction the Old One had been performing throughout the final sequence. The Old One had invited the Slayer inside. The invitation had been declined in reaching this point. The Slayer had not walked into the Old One's body to become what Allant had become, but the alternative seduction remained. If the Maiden could not lull the Old One, if the ritual could not be completed, the Old One would remain awake, and an Old One that remained awake needed a new servant to direct the fog's purpose. The slayer of demons becomes a new, powerful demon in service to the old one, to sate their hunger for souls. The specific outcome of the bad ending is not destruction, not the fog consuming the slayer in the way it had consumed the miners of Stonefang or the civilians of Boletaria. It is transformation. The slayer, having demonstrated through the entire game a willingness to consume souls for power, having grown strong through the Archdemons' souls, through everything the Maiden had channeled, becomes the specific kind of being that such willingness makes. A demon, the entity that the Old One needs to replace the false King Allant, to direct the fog, to lead the consumption, to be what Allant had been before Allant dissolved into the Old One's substance. The Slayer becomes the new instrument of the appetite. The bad ending is not called that because it is morally simpler, or because the game is making a clear ethical statement about what power-seeking produces. It is called that because Boletaria does not get the good outcome. The fog does not recede. The Old One does not sleep. Whatever restoration was possible after the second the Scourge does not happen. But the game is specific about what the Slayer of Demons receives. Power. The specific power that comes from being the instrument of an unlimited appetite. The same power that had transformed Allant from a powerful king into what was found inside the Old One. But in the specific earlier stage of that transformation, where capability was at its height, whether this is appealing, whether the specific power of being the Old One's new instrument is worth what it costs, is the question that the bad ending leaves with the player. Allant had believed that his service to the Old One was mercy. His last form suggested what mercy looked like after the Old One had finished with it. What Allant's last words actually mean. You fool, don't you understand? No one wishes to go on. Slayer of Demons has just chosen by walking away from the Old One, rather than being consumed by it, to go on, to keep existing, to ensure that the world continues, rather than being fed to the appetite. Allant's accusation of foolishness is his final assessment of this choice, from within his transformed body, from inside the argument that had produced the second Scourge, the specific theological position about suffering and mercy that he had developed across the melancholy of his old age. The choice to continue is foolish. It perpetuates the world's suffering rather than ending it. It maintains the existence that no one in his reading actually wants to maintain. He is not simply being cruel. He is not, in his final moments, performing villainy for its own sake. He is making the specific argument that had organized his entire existence from the point when melancholy had produced conviction. One last time, at the moment when the counter-argument had just been expressed through action rather than words, the Slayer of Demons does not respond. The game does not give the player a dialogue option to rebut the argument. The response to "don't you understand, no one wishes to go on" is the action of walking away from the Old One rather than staying inside it. The rebuttal is the behavior, not the rhetoric, whether Allant was right, whether the specific generalization that no one wishes to go on accurately described, dinnered, the inner lives of the people whose existence the Old One was consuming, is the question that both endings leave unanswered. The good ending's hero goes on. The bad ending's slayer becomes a demon in service to the ending of all going on. Both endings begin from the same threshold. The argument between them is conducted in the specific vocabulary of what people do at the moment of decision. What Demon Souls actually is. The first game in the lineage that produced Bloodborne and Dark Souls and Elden Ring. The specific origin of the From Software design language that would go on to define an entire genre, and that the subsequent games refined without fully departing from. It is also in the specific way of something that does not yet know the conventions it is establishing, the most direct version of the argument that all of those games are making. The argument is about power and what it costs and who decides what the world is for. Every soul the Slayer of Demons consumed to grow stronger was a soul taken from something else. The game does not hide this. The demon souls that powered the Slayer's growth were demons' souls, the specific life force of beings who, in most cases, had been something else before the fog transformed them. The miners of Stonefang, the soldiers of Boletaria, Astrea's specific attempt to help the people of the valley, all of them, consumed by the fog, became the specific resource that the Slayer consumed in turn. The Slayer growing stronger was not free. The growth required the same fundamental activity that the Old One's appetites required. The consumption of souls for power. The difference between the Slayer of Demons and the Old One was not in the mechanism. It was in the purpose. The Slayer was consuming souls to end the consuming. The Old One was consuming souls to continue it. Whether this distinction holds, whether consuming souls to end consuming is genuinely different from consuming souls for its own sake, whether the means is separable from the end in the way that the good ending requires, is the specific ethical question that the game puts in the player's hands by having them do the consuming themselves rather than simply witnessing it. King Allant had used the soul arts for prosperity and then for mercy. The Slayer of Demons uses the same arts through the same Maiden in the same Nexus for salvation. The substance is the same. The intended outcome differs. The game asks the player to decide whether that difference is enough. The world that follows, the restored Boletaria, the new monumental standing watch, the fog lifting from the kingdom that Allant XII had ruled and transformed, and in the process of transforming, destroyed. The people who had survived the fog would return to whatever their lives had been before the Second Scourge interrupted them. Thomas the Stoic would have a life without whatever had been in it. Wife and daughter gone, the specific shape of a surviving household that is smaller and quieter than it had been. The soulless miners of Stonefang would continue chiseling. The body that Garl Vinland had been protecting would no longer require protection. The Valley of Defilement would still be the Valley of Defilement, and somewhere in the Nexus, the new Monumental would be maintaining the vigil, waiting, watching the world rebuild, knowing that the specific knowledge of the soul arts, which had been lost, which had been found, which had produced the Second Scourge, would be found again, that someone would descend to where the Maiden taught, that the threshold would be approached again. The cycle is the world's condition, not a flaw in the world's design, a feature of the specific relationship between power and appetite, and the soul arts and the Old One and the Maiden in black and the Nexus. The world is structured such that this happens cyclically until the specific combination of factors that produces a Slayer of Demons who makes the correct choice at the threshold produces the temporary restoration that the good ending depicts. Temporary. The game is honest about this. The specific heroism of putting the Old One to sleep is the heroism of buying time, of being the person who holds the line until the next person has to hold the same line. This is what the Monumentals had always been. This is what the new Monumental would be. The restoration was real. The peace it produced was real. The fact that it would end that the cycle would produce the conditions for the next scourge at some point in the future, that the new Monumentals vigil was meant to delay, was also real. Demon Souls does not resolve this tension. It holds both the value of the restoration and the knowledge of its temporariness simultaneously, in the specific way that the most honest stories about heroism tend to hold both. The hero did something real. The thing they did is genuinely worth doing. It will need to be done again. One final image, the Nexus after the lulling, the fog outside receding, the specific light of a world that had been covered, returning to the spaces that the fog had occupied. The maiden in black, having completed her ritual, present in the Nexus that she tends, lighting the candles, doing what she has always done. The new Monumental somewhere in the Nexus, bound in the specific half-living way of beings who have tied themselves to the structure. The Archstones stand in the spaces they have always occupied. The passages to the 5 regions remain, the specific geography of the Nexus, built around the function of maintaining the relationship between the world and the Old One's sleep, continues. The Old One sleeps below, not destroyed, not ended. Present in the specific quiet of something that requires the right conditions to remain quiet, sleeping, as it had slept between the first and second scourge, as it will sleep until the next awakening. The world on the other side of the Archstones is the world that the second scourge had produced, not the world before Allant XII found the Nexus. That world is gone. The world that follows is the world in which Boletaria had experienced the fog and survived it, and continues with the specific marks that surviving a catastrophe leaves on a civilization. The knowledge of the soul arts is lost. For now, this has been the entire Demon Souls timeline, from the First Scourge and the Monumentals vigil, through King Allant's discovery of the Nexus and the theology of mercy that produced the Scourge, through the 5 regions and the people trapped in the fog and the Archdemons and the true king and the choice at the Old One's threshold, told slowly, over 8 nights, for the dark between waking and wherever sleep takes you. The fog is lifting, for now. Good night, my friend.